Welcome. It's truly an honor and pleasure. Uh, I might talk at length. You've heard me before, so
All right. You should introduce yourself.
okay. I will do that. So my name is Vincent Colapietro. I have taught at a number of places, Fordham, Pennsylvania State, and most recently, at present, I'm teaching at the University of Rhode Island. Michael and I go back. I don't know when we first intersected. It was at the Semiotic Society of America, a word about which I will say a few words pretty shortly. But I'd like to just give you some sense of both the man and the work. And they're both equally fascinating. Our author was born in Japan, and he lived there during World War II. And his first language was Russian. And his second language was Japanese. And his third language was English. Well, that seems to me to make one's early years a destiny almost. How can you not become a linguist given that experience? Completely fascinating family. Mother and father were extremely musically gifted. And Michael is also gifted, but his music is primarily played, I know it's on the piano, but it's primarily played with words. His prose can be utterly musical. He writes exquisitely. He never, you won't be offended, I hope, he never wrote quite as exquisitely as his wife. Who was extremely gifted. One of my memories of the Semiotic Society of America was with Michael and Marianne and Abigail. And here's this, I think she was 12 the first time I saw her. And there were all these academics in high-flown language, and Abigail had a question. And it was actually the best question posed at that session. So I thought, what this child comes by her beauty and radiance honestly from her mother, and her intelligence honestly from her mother and father. So I remember that distinctly. Michael used to listen to American baseball on the Armed Forces radio, and be attentive to the various ways in which American English was different from some of the English he was hearing, because the language of instruction was English, whereas his language, his mother tongue, was Russian, and the second language, as I mentioned, was Japanese. Michael eventually made his way to Southern California, and he went to Hollywood High School. He went to Southern California. We don't hold that against him. Or if we do, very, very little. Is that Woody Allen movie where he goes out to L.A. and he says, he gets sick immediately because he's a New Yorker? I get that. Okay. So Michael did his undergraduate work at UCLA, spent a fair amount of time watching basketball, the great teams, and then he went to Harvard and worked with, I think, the foremost linguist, at least in the second half of the 20th century, Roman Jakobson. And Jakobson was a phenomenal intellect and theorist who was broad-ranging and deep-cutting. And Michael has that same character, same quality of mind. So let me think about a word or two about semiotics, because this is not a commonplace word, even among educated people. So in the late 19th century, at roughly the same time, in Switzerland and in Milford, Pennsylvania, in Switzerland, with Saussure, Ferdinand de Saussure, the great linguist, and in this backwater, he calls it the wilds of Pennsylvania, Charles Peirce, both imagined a general comprehensive theory of signs. Now, we are immersed in a world of signs, and we don't know, so linguistics is obviously the scientific study of verbal or linguistic signs, but language is not the only system of signs. There's music, when we get dressed up, we're saying something. Medicine from centuries ago was essentially semiotic discipline. You wake up with spots. Those signs say something. Probably say, it's not going so well today, right? There's a wonderful story in Darwin's biography where he's going, he's taking a tramp through the countryside with his geology teacher, and the geology teacher is opening his eyes, and here's where the glacier came through, and these rocks are older than and Darwin says, a burnt down house could not tell its story more plainly than these rocks. So their signs are all over, and they're not just culturally produced signs. A fossil is a naturally produced sign. The lay of the land, the glacier valley, those are naturally produced signs which are significant apart from intention and apart from consciousness. We don't necessarily have to intend the sign. We don't even have to. Something might be significant, and we might miss its significance. So one of the great semioticians, of course, is Sigmund Freud. Sometimes a cigar is a cigar, right? Just a cigar, and sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it means more than that, right? And the various kinds of slips that people. It's not maybe accidental. Maybe it's significant in ways that is a betrayal of one's own unconscious. So Michael is expert in not only linguistics, but in semiotics. And while de Saussure was a theorist who was trained as a linguist in envisioning a general theory of signs, that is not principally the research tradition in which Michael is rooted. He's much more deeply rooted in the Peircean. So we have the semiological tradition of Saussure, structuralism, post-structuralism, postmodernism. There's a really quite interesting trajectory there. And then we have the pragmatic semiotics of Peirce and Tom Short and Michael Shapiro. So Michael comes at this thing, and partly he's picking up on things conceived by Jakobson, because Jakobson was a linguist who got the importance of Peirce. But that doesn't speak at all against Michael's own originality. Michael's original in ways that I don't even think Jakobson was. Michael has the great misfortune of having lived his professional life in a discipline that, in a way, made a fundamentally wrong turn. And so the irony of ironies, and I am not the first to point this out, is that there's the political Chomsky and there's the linguist Chomsky. And nobody has been more indefatigable in their opposition to political imperialism than Noam Chomsky. And nobody has been, within any discipline in the United States, more given to disciplinary imperialism than Noam Chomsky. And so if you weren't doing transformational grammar, you weren't doing linguistics. And so Michael was able to negotiate the field and be tremendous. He taught at Brown. His credentials are unbelievable. However, had not his discipline been in the stranglehold of Chomsky's transformational grammar, his career would have been even more stellar and more radiant. But as it is, it still is. Okay, so just to take a step back, his parents were born in pre-Soviet Russia. And both his father and his mother, his father were gifted, but his father was academically, intellectually gifted, so he comes by this in utterly honest fashion. But this is Michael Shapiro. He puts together a collection of his father's writings in, I think, 3 languages. I might be wrong about that. He puts together a collection of his wife's writings on Dante and on Italian literature more generally. She was one of, if not the premier Italianist during her lifetime. So we're talking about an extremely high-powered family who knew whence they came and never forgot the deep familial and intellectual debts and paid them gratefully, generously. But Michael's not only his father's son or his mother's son. Michael also is a really quite formidable theorist, intellectual in his own right. And this most recent book, The Logic of Language, a semiotic study of speech, is a, in my judgment, extremely important work. It's a synthesis, but it goes beyond being merely a synthesis of really quite creative work. And one of my favorite books on language is The Sense of Grammar, that was published in the early 80s by Indiana University Press. And but there's another book I like a lot more than that, and that's the later book, the Sense of Change, which is Language as History. So just bear with me just a second more here. Language presents us with a seemingly, the possibility of a seemingly logical structure, and we can just get at that structure. And that's an important facet of language. But you'll notice it's speech in the subtitle. It's speech, because it's not the formal system that's ultimately important. It's the human interaction that is absolutely crucial. And this is what Michael gets as well as any linguist or semiotician alive or who has ever been alive. That it's precisely the ongoing social, potentially transformative interaction, social interaction, right? Not simply social, because the self addresses itself. Right? There are not merely social dialogues, there are reflexive dialogues. How could you be so stupid as to be running that, at night, not looking where you're going? Self-addressing the self in not a very kindly fashion. So Michael is a man who knows whence he came. He makes reference early in this book that Edward Shapiro is one of his influences, and as only Michael, I think, so deftly he connects his name and Shapiro's name as variants of the same name, and so Michael is attuned to the discovery of affinity and kinship, not the obvious ones, but the important ones. Yes, the obvious ones, but not just the obvious ones. Michael can at times describe his project as neo-structuralist, and he gets the power and the importance of structuralism, but it's not ultimately about formal system. It's about human interaction, and that registers not merely at the level of theory. That registers at the level of life. When one has spent any time with Michael, one knows one is in conversation with a real human being, talking about real things about which he is passionate. So the accent falls decisively on speech, on dialogue, on conversation. That lends itself to formalization to some extent, and let's do all that hard work and fancy stuff, but let's never forget that we're addressing human beings about human concerns in a language that should be widely accessible, more widely accessible than it all too often is. So Michael has a sense of audience. He writes for human beings. He does not write simply for other academics. I'm going to now turn to you, Michael, and ask you, what most important did I leave out? What did you want me to say that I failed to say?
Well, thank you very much for your kindness, and I don't know if I can live up to all the praise that you heaped on me, but I'll try to do my best. I think that Vincent has placed the emphasis on the right thing, and that is that language is what makes us human more than anything else. I mean, we can think of all kinds of physiological things. I mean, we have to have sex in order to reproduce ourselves, but our interaction is largely through language. And I insist on the formula that I've devised, which is that we are what we say. You can say that you are what you look like, you are what you do, but there's nothing more important than what you say. Saying is doing, but it's a kind of doing which stands by itself, because it's a kind of doing that has to conform to something over and above your own desires or your goals. Because in order to communicate with other people, you have to use the same signs. Because if I speak Japanese to a person who doesn't know Japanese, I'm not going to communicate anything, so I'm not going to achieve anything that I might want to achieve. I'll tell you an anecdote that might help give you an insight into what I'm talking about. I had 4 brothers, all of whom were older, so there were 5 of us, 5 boys, and a brother who died 2 years ago, Jacob, was born in China, in Harbin, which is in Manchuria, and immigrated to Japan together with my parents. My parents came from Russia, and since my mother was born in Russia, but her father lived in China for a long time and was a contractor in Harbin, and he was part of the Russian workforce that built the Trans-Siberian Railroad. He just stayed in Manchuria. Anyway, my brother Jacob, who was born in Harbin, but grew up mostly in Japan, went to the American school in Japan and so on, told me a joke, which is not a joke, I mean, this is a real thing. He once was driving around outside of Tokyo in a place where he didn't recognize the road. So he saw a farmer and he stopped and he said to the farmer, "Can you tell me how I can get back on the highway?" In perfect Japanese, because we all spoke Japanese. And do you know what the farmer said to him? This is a true story. The farmer said to him, "I'm sorry, but I don't speak English." And this is very characteristic of the Japanese reaction to people who speak perfect Japanese. They can't believe their ears. Not anymore, but this was just after the war. This brother was 11 years older than me, so. But this business of communicating, we have body language. We can do things with our bodies which communicate in patterns which are habitual between human beings. So shrugging with your shoulders is a common thing that we do. I mean, all over the world, people shrug, or they laugh, or they sneeze. Well, sneezing is not linguistic, but there are many things that we do that are non-linguistic, but which are part of our communicative universe. And for instance, this business with the hands, why? I mean, what's the point of doing this? I can't figure it out still. I'm amazed at how many people do this constantly. Do you notice how many people do it on TV? All the TV people are doing this. Anyway, the language is the most important communicative tool that we have. It's the one that, as a habit, as something which is habitual, and that's important. Because Peirce, my hero, Charles Peirce, insisted that these signs, whatever kind of sign they are, eventually form habits. So we resort to them habitually. If we didn't, they wouldn't be effective.
So one thing we're going to do, we're going to have can I interview?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to just have a little talk and then
Is this getting across, by the way?
Can you hear us okay?
Can you hear?
Great. So the emphasis on the habit, I want to connect two things,
Yeah.
Dave. It's Michael. The emphasis on we are what we say, Feuerbach, we are what we eat.
Yeah.
But we are what we say. And then but when we bring in habit, I just want you to, because you know this better than I do actually, but it seems that we need to bring in all three tenses, right? I'm going to tell a bad joke.
Okay. Did
Did
you like my joke about the Japanese
I
man?
loved it. I loved it. Yeah. So the past, the present, and the future went into a bar.
Talking to the microphone.
They went into a bar. It was tense. I know, really bad. But the serious point has nothing to do with the bar. But with so past what we have said, what we are now saying, and what we might yet be able to say, but at present cannot. So habit, in a Peircean sense, turns out to be much more paradoxical because sometimes we tend to think of habits as mechanical routines or even ruts. Now, Federer, those men, they have those shots grooved. But precisely because those habits have been so deeply formed, and you can use the musical analogy too, not just the athletic, just they can improvise jump shot precisely because the habit is so deeply rooted in the body, right? So habits are not ruts. Habits, in the best circumstances, when they're properly formed and thought about, are actually resources for improvisation. And this is crucial for language, because when we fall back too readily upon the familiar, in the habitual, in the bad sense, we we're speaking cliches and hackneyed phrases. But it's precisely, how do I speak? How do I address this child in this circumstance where I'm audible, where they can hear me, right? And that's a mean trick. How can I address this class, right? They don't seem to be hearing me, if that's not for me to get mad at them, that's like stupid. I am not speaking in a language that's sufficiently audible to this audience. So the ability to form new habits, to improvise in the backdrop of deeply rooted habits. So it seems to me that the Peircean notion of habit provides us with an understanding of habits as a resource for improvisation. And so it's not just what we, and you know this, and I learned this mostly from you. It's not just we are what we say. We are what we have said. We are what we are now saying. Yeah. And what we might.
That's a very good point, Vincent. That it's not just what we're saying at a given moment. It's what we've said and what we're capable of saying. And although I'm very critical of Chomsky, he did stress the idea that language is for future use. That if your grammar is future oriented, and it has to be in order to be able to say things that are new, depending on the circumstances, then you have to be able to account for new utterances, that every human being is capable of uttering things which are not just formulas. But what I'm interested in is not the rules by which what you say is structured, but what makes what you say hang together. Why is it coherent? And the modern contemporary linguistics, doesn't talk about coherence very much. And one thing I wanted to stress is, I don't know in this group of whether people are aware of a school of linguistics which is very prominent now called cognitive linguistics. And my first criticism of that group is that it's a pleonasm to say cognitive linguistics. There cannot be any other kind of linguistics but cognitive. It has to do with thought. The instrument of thought for every human being is language. When you think, no matter what you're thinking, it has to be in language. Once you're beyond childhood, we don't know what a 2-year-old is, what's going on in their brain. But once they become full users of the language that they're exposed to, they're thinking in terms of that language. And it's that which allows them to think. Because you can't just have feelings. If you want to communicate your feelings to other people, it has to be in language. Of course, you can hug somebody, and then there's interpretation. And that's something that I want to stress. In this book, I stress the idea that all speech is subject to interpretation. And it's not just rules of grammar. It's interpretation of how the speech is structured. Not just how it's structured, but the interpretation of how it's structured. And that involves history as well. So it's your own personal history, the history of the language. You don't need to be an etymologist, and know where the word comes from. You know what you said, what other people have said in the past, how people express themselves, and that is then part of the...
Right. But thank you. That's extremely illuminating. But precisely because I've just loved this book on change, the sense of change, subtitled "Language as History." We and this is what I've learned from you, among other things. History does not mean the past, primarily, right? So there's a famous line from the William Faulkner play, Requiem for a Nun, where actually the title character, the past is not dead and gone, it's not even past. Right? So the past is always alive in the present. And either we own up to that past, or that past owns us. This seems to be important. And picking up on another thing you're saying, I think there's a point of divergence, and we can't be too congenial. Maybe a little bit of secondness, opposition would be
Okay.
I'm
ready.
But I interrupted myself with that. I didn't want to necessarily. But I was looking at the cover of the book you put together of your father's writings, and of course that's musical notation. And Michael, I've been corresponding, stresses appropriately language, but I wonder, because mathematics is another system, and mathematicians actually think in language, and musicians think in tones and rhythm and melody. They don't think in language and then translate the linguistic into the musical. The mathematician doesn't necessarily think in language and then translate it into mathematical symbols. So there are these irreducibly different sign systems. And yes, language is really important, but maybe there are things that can be expressed in music that cannot be expressed in language. And maybe there are things that can be expressed in mathematics.
Yeah, I don't think we diverge on that.
Oh.
It's just a matter of emphasis.
No, I think that's right.
Yeah.
But that seems to be an important point to make.
Yeah, it is important that there are other sign systems besides linguistic sign systems. I'm just saying that the most important sign system, what Hjelmslev, a Danish linguist, called the passkey semiotic. Passkey, that it's the key by which one has access to all other sign systems as language. Why? Because it is the instrument of thought and communication. Yeah. So when a mathematician thinks of math, of relationships, they're thinking both linguistically and mathematically. And then they have to express themselves mathematically in terms of formulas and notation. And my father was a very good mathematician, by the way. And I did calculus in both integral and differential in college, and I thought I was going to be an engineer, and then I gave that up. But you can see that this passkey semiotic idea, the idea that this passkey sign system is language, is important because of cognition. The thinking is in terms of signs, but the primary way of thinking in terms of signs is in terms of linguistic signs.
Yeah, your emphasis is maybe just a little greater than mine, because I'm so taken by music, but
yeah.
So I want to pick up on something, and this is what you get as a linguist and also just as a human being. So obviously, Michael has already stressed this point that there's a grammar. Only certain combinations are intelligible within a given language. And so some things are not permissible, but then comes along E.E. Cummings, right? And all bets are off. What are the limits to the ungrammatical or the unconventional? Right? And this is precisely, it seems to me, and Chomsky got this, that any kind of language doesn't do justice to our linguistic and our otherwise semiotic creativity is an inadequate theory. Only a theory which puts central, at the very center, at the very heart of things, creativity. And so language arguably is most alive in metaphor. Breaking a rule, saying something that in a strict literal sense is improper, but more deeply meaningful than saying something in a straightforward literal way. And so it seems to me linguistic creativity is on full display in our capacity to use metaphor. And so it's peace, and it's not only there, right? But it's so it's if we're talking about human speakers thrown into historical circumstances and having to say something that has never been said before, we have to stretch language beyond the limits. And that's what saying things otherwise, saying things in ways that have never been said before. Being linguistically, semiotically creative, that seems to be very important. And this is not our point of divergence, I realize.
Yeah. On this point, you might be interested in something which I've written about, not at great length, but that all kinds of claims have been made for language in other creatures besides humans. For instance, birds or monkeys. Because for instance, we share so much physical capacity with orangutans and bonobos, and they seem to communicate with each other. But there's one thing that even birds or bonobos can't do, and only we can do, and that is to mean something other than what we say. And that's at the heart of figures of speech. So we mean something. If I say the moon is made of cheese, I don't mean literally that it's made of cheese, and so my interlocutor has to realize and that interlocutor as a human being realizes that. Whereas a dog, if you train a dog or a parrot enough to understand human speech, if you say the moon is made of cheese, that parrot will think you literally mean that the moon is made of cheese. They are not capable of understanding something to mean something other than what you say. And that is our human capacity, which is tropology, which I write about. Tropes, not just metaphor, metonymy, other kinds of tropes. And that's an exclusively human capacity to mean something other than what we say. And that formula has a lot of ramifications. It's a very, very profound. I don't know if I can claim to have invented that formula, but I've written about it in that way. And I've written, Marianne, my wife, and I wrote a little book on tropes, the semiotics of tropes, in which we showed how this idea functions through language. And you can see that how important it is in speech that we use tropes. We don't just say things which are literal, we say things that are figural. Why do we do that? Why do poets rely so much on figural speech? Because it's not interesting. One thing that I learned from my wife, Marianne, I learned a lot from her, and I think about her all the time. She's in my heart. I don't need a gravestone to remember her. She hated cliches. It's the one thing that she always, when someone talked in cliches, she erupted. And she would say things to them, which of course hurt her academically, because academics so often talk in cliches. And she had a terrible career. Her career was a disaster because she played in the sandbox where the literalists played. And she was a metaphorical. You can't do that. Especially in Italian studies. The Italianists were all men, not women, and they hated when a woman invented a way of talking about Italian literature, and especially Dante. That is the most important author for an Italian. Even today, every child in Italy learns Dante by heart. Yeah. Not Petrarch, not Boccaccio, Dante.
So your point is...
An Italian man here,
yeah.
An Italian wife.
But your point it's a very important and eloquently stated point. But that's partly what makes us such treacherous animals, right? Because and I would push it farther because
lying can,
of course,
yeah.
Lying,
yeah,
and always. I'm enough of a Freudian to think that we always mean more than we say and other than we say, in ways that are really complex. What are you really saying to me in this situation, right?
Yeah.
You say, oh, I hear you. This other stuff. No, I hear what you say. So I think it makes us treacherous. It makes us dangerous in ways to ourselves and to others. So we should just open them. Should we?
Yeah, just open it up. Yeah.
Open it up. Who wants first?
Questions, comments,
Criticism?
criticisms. You can throw apples and oranges at us too.
Throw it to my good arm.
Well, I have a question. So when you were talking about mathematical signs and semiotics and that mathematicians think in symbols or mathematical symbols, and maybe musicologists or musicians think in notes, when you talk about those things, because I guess unless it's another mathematician or musician, you have to describe what you're trying to get across. Is there any kind of I don't know what you would call it, workaround or theory around how that translation occurs, even though it's the same, an English speaker, for example, might be speaking to another English speaker, but about a system of signs that's not verbal? Is there a translation effect that happens?
You want to go first?
No, you go first.
There certainly can be. There also can be an extremely detrimental effect. So where this is true of a lot of. There's a discourse about jazz that, in some sense, replaces the discourse of jazz.
Mm-hmm.
People writing about it, and so Miles Davis was aware of this, and he'd hear some people in his band, talking all this fancy talk, and he'd say, "How's that sound on your instrument? Could you play that on your instrument?" And if you can't, I don't think I'm very interested. So it seems to me that what is the principal medium, and what is the secondary discourse doing for one's mastery or simply cultivating one's competence in the musical medium, right? And so it may be the case that as good a book as Gödel's theorem is, it's somewhat light on the mathematics, and you can't, if you don't do the mathematics, you can't get a kind of understanding about completeness and consistency, but you really have to understand the math to understand the math.
Yeah, I have something to say actually about maybe a little tangential, but because it has to do with music. The idea that music is a language is a cliche, but it's valid. A cliche is valid. Just because it's literal doesn't mean that it's bad. But the thing that differentiates music and language, speech specifically, because they're both audio. You can't have music only on a piece of paper. It has to be performed. And why? Because the full emotional effect of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony cannot be received simply by looking at the score. And what is that emotional effect? What's the emotional effect of music? Well, people have argued about that. It's much easier to talk about the emotional effect of language. If I say, "You are a goddamn cocksucking stupid idiot," sorry, but I want it to have an emotional effect. And the ladies don't have cocks, so that has an emotional effect on the person not only uttering that, but perceiving that. Now, with music, it's much more intangible, but it's much stronger. If you are a musician, I can tell you that I experienced this as a clarinetist. Marianne was a pianist, a brilliant pianist, who wanted to go to the conservatory, but her parents wouldn't let her do it. She graduated from music and art in New York and wanted to go to the conservatory, and she kept playing the piano all her life. And I was a clarinetist I played with my parents. But I can tell you that the emotional bond between us, we loved each other very much. We had one child who's sitting here. So there couldn't have been simply a physiological thing. There was an emotional bond. I can tell you that music, and since Vincent teaches about music, do you play an instrument? No. There is no, when I played trios with my parents, and looking back on that, there was no way of expressing that in speech. What it had, the effect it had on me. When you go to a concert and you hear music, that effect cannot be reproduced by speech. You can talk about it, and there are music critics who write in the New York Times about how brilliant so-and-so was and all that. And, you know, and glissandos and I don't know what else.
Right.
When Marianne and I played the duo literature of clarinet and piano, and we played the entire duo literature, the emotional effect on that could not be expressed in words.
Yeah.
So there is something about words which pales in, by comparison in significance with other sign systems. But I'm a linguist, so I don't write music criticism. My father did. And that's something to keep in mind. Emotional effect and affect, A-F-F and E-F-F, both. And Peirce actually talked about the emotional interpretant. He coined the word, I think he coined it, right?
He did.
Interpretant. It's the sign, that aspect of the sign, which we interpret. And that comes full force in my book in something which is technical called markedness, because that has to do with significance. You know, something is more hierarchically more highly valued than something else. For instance, women are more marked than men. I mean, it just happens to be a fact.
Because patriarchy is a fact.
Yeah.
Right.
So that,
So you say the judge handed down a verdict,
yeah,
unmarked signifier.
right.
But then you say, well, the black woman judge. So it's a marked signifier.
Notice that the word hostess has gone out of the language, or waitress. Sorry, hostess is okay. But you can't say waitress, it's got to be server. Why? Because it's marked.
Yeah.
If you said host, you wouldn't know whether it's a woman or a man. You tend to, the neutral one tends to be interpreted as a male.
So this notion of interpretant seems to, so there's the emotional interpretant. Somebody knocks on your door, and you have the feeling of being irritated because you're being interrupted. So that would be the emotional interpretant.
Yeah.
And that prompts you to pretend you're not there. And that would be the energetic. What action, right? And then there are the cognitive, or what he calls the logical interpretants. You start thinking, well, maybe it's somebody important. Maybe it's one of the kids, and they need help. So even the simplest sign can generate emotional, energetic action, and conceptual, logical interpretants. And so, and this happens so rapidly, so habitually, so unreflectively, that we don't even notice what's going on, right? And so we cannot help but think in signs, but we don't always think about signs. And it's the capacity to do that analytically, critically, imaginatively, to think about signs, not merely to use them. You know, and you know, the kind of, you know, where somebody else is in, he starts talking, oh, what do you ladies want? And then somebody said, you know, so 2000 whatever, 22. And the justification is, well, I didn't think you would mind. And the rejoinder is, yeah, you didn't think. So, you know, not merely using signs, but using them in a thoughtful, appropriate, creative, imaginative way. Amy, how are you?
I'm okay. It's
great to see you.
Yes. My question is about the markedness of silence. You were talking about linguistic systems and musical systems, and I wonder if you could talk about silence as at all, but also, do you think it has more markedness in a linguistic system or in a musical system? I was thinking about John Cage. Yeah. Obviously.
Yeah. So I'll do it first. Then you
Go ahead. Yeah.
So you're at a conference and you say something. You say that was not stupid. That might have been actually pretty good. So I was at a conference and I said there are as many genres of silence as there are of music. So there's reverential silence. There's the silence of cold anger, right? There's a silence of respect and stepping back and shutting up and letting the other person talk. So, right,
But they're all signs.
yeah,
That's the important thing.
yeah, and then one might need to look at what does the use of silence in this fashion, in this context, mean for the uses of silence and silence, right? So the Cage thing is partly is trying to make us become attentive to the music of the ambiance, the unintentional music of the ambiance. Yeah. We don't learn how to listen to your world, right? It's an encouragement, it's a directive. So, I think silence is, and we actually should cultivate it, because if we don't cultivate silence, it's like being bombarded with cliches. The first thing you do is turn on the stereo or whatever, the radio, and it has a way of rendering our ears dull. Our ears become smaller rather than bigger if we don't deliberately embrace silence.
Yeah. All I would say, in addition, is that silence is significant only by contrast with non-silence. And that's where the markedness comes in. Markedness always involves oppositions, but it goes beyond just the physical fact of speech, let's say, versus silence. It means an interpretation of the contrast between the two. They don't need to be oppositions, they could be contrasts. There's a difference between contrast and opposition. Opposition is A versus non-A. Contrast is A and other than A. And this is one of the important concepts that I stress in my work, that we are creatures that only function through hierarchy. There is no such thing as non-hierarchical behavior. And we learn this from our parents and from being human, that our brains are so structured, physiologically and ideologically, that we only can be hierarchical creatures. And you can say, well, it's not politically incorrect to be hierarchical. You should treat everybody equally. But we are inherently incapable of being non-judgmental or non-hierarchical in our behavior, among other reasons being that our language is hierarchical. So if we think in terms of language, if language is the instrument of our cognition and our thought, then it imposes hierarchical behavior on us. Of course, you could say, what does that have, somebody wants power. Hitler comes along and just wants power and he starts killing people. So this is hierarchy, right? The government imposes hierarchy. That has, that is true but not relevant. Why people do things that are evil is something which religion has never come up with an answer to. I'm Jewish.
but I'm only a Jew as someone who was born to Jewish parents who immigrated and so on. So I think of myself as a Jew who travels, you know, the eternal Jew kind of Jew. I don't go to the synagogue, I don't worship God and so on. But evil is the most fundamental problem that no religion has really solved. Do you know that if you look in the Jewish encyclopedia, there's no entry for evil? Isn't that strange? Why don't Jews deal with evil? Catholics do.
Well, I feel a little bit.
You're Catholic.
Well, by origin.
Yeah.
But let me say this. I mean, I've been reading. I'm teaching a course in ethics, and I draw upon. I introduce them to Buddhism, and to Judaism, and to some Christianity, and so I've been reading a fair amount of Rabbi Heschel.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, so when Martin Luther King gave the talk at Riverside Cathedral in New York City, the famous talk, Beyond Vietnam, also entitled Breaking the Silence, and where he said he was confronted by the youth, and they said, you tell us not to resort to violence, and you spend a lot of words telling us that, and you have not spent one word telling your government not to resort to violence in Southeast Asia. And King says they were right. They were right. And Heschel introduces King on that night. It's very powerful. They were very, very good friends. Heschel walked, he marched. He's one of his famous lines is, "I'm praying with my feet," when he was marching. Heschel talks a lot about evil.
Oh, he does. Okay, good.
Yeah,
I'm glad to hear it.
and the connection is with the failure to respond. That's the root of evil, a kind of inattention. Well, how did you not? What did you think that? What did you think that smoke was? That was gut wrenching. Don't tell me you didn't know what it was. Right, coming out of the death camps. Right, so the cultivated inattention for
To other people's suffering.
yeah, exactly.
That's the main thing.
That's
the main thing.
It doesn't explain it, but it
Yeah,
does.
it's the inattention and lack of action in the face of other people's suffering. That's what evil is, no?
But it's not the same as being the instigator and creator of the evil. It's a different subcategory,
Yeah.
if nothing else. If not a different
No,
category
that's
altogether.
but Heschel's point is that for great evil to occur, all you need are silent, complicit witnesses. So yes, the perpetrator has hell to pay. But there are certain times when you say, why wasn't that person left off the stage?
Yeah.
Well, where were people?
Yeah, I think the first category, or the
Please.
perpetrator category of evil, is related to desire. And the second category, the passive evil, is related to fear. And they're both evil. I agree with him on that. But
Yeah.
I don't think they're
Fear and surrogate desire.
they're related. They're related through something bad that's happening, but as emotions for the people concerned, I think
Right.
they're rather different.
Yeah.
So
Oh no, I think they are different. But how does it happen on the scale it does happen?
We're getting off our subject.
yeah, we are a little bit. Yeah.
Any
So
other-
we were on markedness, I think. Yeah. And markedness of silence.
Well, the reason that I stress markedness is I learned it from my teacher, Roman Jakobson, with whom I had a very fraught relationship. And I can tell you something, I don't know if I've ever mentioned this to you, about how he tried to interfere with my tenure process. at UCLA, he called the dean because I had written something against him and published it. And he called the dean of the college at UCLA and said, don't give tenure to Shapiro. And to his great credit, my colleague, who was also a student of Jacobson, said, I'm going to resign from your journal as managing editor. He said to he told me this. If you go on doing things like that, Shapiro's getting tenure. And I got it. Okay, so, but markedness is inherent in our human capacity for thought. That's the thing. It's not an ad structure. It's not just something that we clap onto language or behavior. It transcends, because of Peirce's idea of interpreting, he doesn't mention the word markedness. This comes from Prague structuralism through Jacobson, markiert in German.
Right.
And it means that a matter of value, that something is hierarchically of higher value or lower value. But it doesn't have to be high and low. It can be a difference called marked and unmarked. That's the technical differentiation.
But would you say, okay, so
That's the interpretant.
right, hierarchical arrangements are in some ways inescapable. So all of this noise about elitism being bad, you know, when the coach of the college team says your child's an elite athlete or your child is an elite musician, they're actually giving a rather high compliment. And you don't tell LeBron James or somebody, you're just one of the guys. He's like, I'm right up there with Michael or whoever, right? So they want to be elite. They insist, right? So,
Well, that's a perversion of the word elite.
it is certainly. But my point has to do with really hierarchy, because the isn't the problem. So yeah, we some things are better than others. Some things are exalted, some things are ignoble. So we cannot help but make judgments, and these judgments have a kind of scale, hierarchical scale. But isn't the problem that they're fixed, irreversible hierarchies?
In language, yes.
And well, yeah, of course, but also in culture.
Yeah, but you start with cognition, and with language as the instrument of cognition. And markedness is built into cognition, and therefore the way language is structured, so it's part of grammar. And this book is largely about that,
Right.
and about how language grows. When it is historical, markedness plays a role in how language is developed. Why aren't we speaking the way the Anglo-Saxons spoke? We're speaking American English, which is different, let's say, from the way people spoke 100 years ago. Why did it change? Why did the language change? There's something inherent about language which leads to change. Of course, you could say people make mistakes. They mishear something, and they say, why do people keep saying Iranian when the traditional term is Iranian? The British English and American English of the old days, you said Iranian, not Iranian. And I wrote an article about this, which was published in the American Speech, about flat. The technical term is flat, broad, and flat So you have in American English, people differ in the way they pronounce that There are many words like that, not just Iranian, Iranian. But the language has changed. Why? It has to do with markedness. So the interpretation aspect of speech is what, to a large extent, the examples that I choose to examine and analyze in my book have to do with. And they have not been given it sufficient attention in the history of linguistics. And linguistics is not taught with an emphasis on that, as far as I know. I mean, I've been retired since 2003, so what do I know? What's going on in the Brown Department of Cognitive Science. I don't know what they're teaching. Linguistics is an utterly balkanized field. Every time you pick up a textbook on linguistics, it's a little bit different.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't know what book to use now. If I were teaching an introduction to linguistics, I would only use my own books. I would say, the hell with it, I'll teach you the way I think is correct. But this idea of interpretation, which is at the heart of the Persian doctrine of science, I have utilized to examine how language is structured. What is the structure of grammar, and what causes it to change? And if there is a change, is there a directionality? Towards what does it change? Because Peirce's idea was that there's always a goal. It's not random. Ultimately, there is a structure to the changes. And that's what teleology is, towards the goal. This goal-oriented change is at the heart of much of what Peirce taught, and which I've incorporated into my analysis of speech.
But the goals, many of the goals are not fixed in advance.
No, they're not.
They emerge in the course of
That's
history.
right.
What about like stasis, where you have something like French Canadian, or like in West Virginia, there's supposed to be those Appalachian villages where they still speak in English accents because they haven't been exposed to change, I guess. Does that have a goal,
That cannot
or
be
is that a
predicted.
lack of a goal?
It cannot be predicted. And the goal is valid in terms of what goes on in that particular speech community. When you widen the speech community, the tendency, statistically, is for change to happen. If you have millions of people speaking the same language, the opportunity for change increases. It could be partly because human beings differ in the way that they interpret what they hear. We all have our ways of interpreting speech, and that they have to conform to the grammar, otherwise we can't be understood. But beyond that, there are things we can do. And this is something that I'm now working on in my mind. If I'm asked to give a talk, I'm going to give a talk on variation.
Oh, wow.
On variation, which is a very important thing.
Yeah.
Why do things vary
Yeah.
in language? Why isn't it just static?
But what provides the goal of the process?
It's
And,
internal.
and is it asymptotically getting closer to the goal, or is the goal
Yes.
always moving?
It is asymptotic. And I write
Never
about
reaches
this in the book.
Yeah.
Never reaches it.
But you know what determines that goal? Coherence. The coherence between the sign and the meaning. And when you have sounds, the sounds don't have meanings by themselves. They participate in
Yeah.
strings that are meaningful, words. But if I go puh, it's meaningless. It has to be pop, or pat, or
Pumpkin.
pink, or pumpkin, or something. But then when they come together, then there is a goal, which is coherence. And that's one thing I stress in the book, that the goal ultimately is the coherence between sign and meaning. That it's not arbitrary. This is where I think Saussure was wrong. He said that the sign is arbitrary. That what he meant was that in English we say tree, and in French we say arbre. And that's arbitrary. But that's not interesting. And that should not be the basis for a theory of language. So my work has fought for many years against Saussure, against Jacobson, because he didn't go far enough. And the way I wage this war is by putting Peircean ideas into linguistics.
Right.
And that's where, unfortunately, I've been more or less alone.
Right.
Very few people, even my students haven't followed me. I can't think of a single, I've had hundreds of students. I can't think of a
You
single.
mean in the formal sense of institutional student?
Yeah, like I've taught for over 50
I
years.
followed you. I understand.
People who sat in my classes,
Yeah.
they didn't,
Yeah, but some of us have sat in on your books.
yeah. No, I know there are people.
I understand what you're saying, but I think it's important to think about our influence as teachers extending far beyond the haphazard
Yeah.
collection.
One thing that might interest you actually, that Vincent didn't mention, is I taught 3 summer NEH summer seminars for postdoctoral students. One at UCLA, one at Princeton, and one at Brown. And guess who came to, and these seminars were on Perse and language. But guess who came to those seminars? There were 12 people in each seminar. I don't think the NEH does this anymore.
They do.
They do? Okay, so I had 35 students, because one didn't show up. Guess who came? Music theorists. They wanted to learn how to apply Persian semiotics to music theory. And I must say, that's where I had what I think the most
Robert?
important thing, like Robert Hatton, who's a very prominent music theorist at the University of Texas, who just retired. You know, his name is the Society of Music Theory. He's written several books. He was my student, but not in the seminar. He was a postdoctoral fellow at Penn when I was teaching at Princeton, and he would come over to Princeton and take a course with me, which was not a course. You know, I would just teach him privately, and then he incorporated that into his work. But there are others. There's Bill Doherty, William Doherty, teaches at Drake. There was other music theorists. So I think that music theory somehow is more open to
They
the
are.
way I do things.
But you
and-
also had literary theorists. You had a fellow from Alaska.
Right,
Oh,
Michael Haley.
And Jim was in Alaska at that
Jim
time.
Lischka was my student, but he's a philosopher. So,
Yeah, right.
yeah, so there are students that I had in my seminars who borrowed from me or who were influenced by me. But I can say that the language people didn't. And I taught poetics. I taught a lot of poetry courses.
Did you have funding for a 4th one?
No, I never, I couldn't get it. I was going to give one at Columbia and they turned me down.
Okay.
But I did not try to make poetry courses into theory courses. I analyzed poetry in ways that I had been taught by Johann Roman Jakobson. My father was a poet. Some of this stuff that is in this book is his poetry. He wrote in French, German, and English and Russian, so 4 languages.
But the notion of coherence is really crucial.
Yeah, it is.
But part of the really thorny difficulty, of course, is that we're talking about such language proliferates such multiplicity. And it's easy if you're dealing with 1 or 2 voices or 1 or 2 genres and have them hang together or cohere. But when you have this explosively prolific phenomenon of language, and then how do you get that stuff? And it seems to me that it's on the one hand an impossible task, but on the other hand, it's try to do the best you can. You know, the line from Samuel Beckett's one of, fail better.
Yeah. Well, you can certainly see how variation, if one of the natural attributes of language is to have variation, right?
Right.
An unpredictable variation,
Right.
or a certain variation with a certain level of unpredictability, put
Yeah.
it that way.
Yeah,
Then that will give you also variations in coherence and, in more simple language, variations in success. So those variations will have different levels of success
right.
as communication tools, right? Which is sort of
No,
like coherence.
it's true.
Yeah.
Variants compete with each other.
Yeah, and that on its own creates a mechanism for change
Yeah.
over
Yes.
5 weeks, 5 years, 5 centuries,
Yeah.
etc.
That's
Right?
good. That's good.
You know, there's a competition that people don't even realize is going on when they use variants. In the same language, if one says Iranian and the other says Iranian,
Yeah.
they mean the person who says Iranian on TV or radio may look down on someone who says Iranian and say, that's not the way you say it. No, we say Iranian.
Where does that come from again? You didn't explain the background to it.
It's an imitation of the source language.
But is it?
Yes.
Okay. But a lot of times,
It's a search for authenticity, which is particularly acute in English. American English in particular, people want to sound authentic. And one way of sounding authentic is to be closer to the source language of a word which is not English.
or the perceived source language.
Yeah,
So like Slavic things get pronounced like they're in Spanish, and
yeah, well, people don't know these languages, but they think. But authenticity is a value in American language, English, which is not shared, let's say, by Japanese or Russian. Russians don't go around mispronouncing words to sound more like the source language of that word. They just don't do it. It's all Russian. You know, they're totally imperialistic, just the way they are with Ukraine. I think we should stop this.
Sure.
It's close to 6.
Okay.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.